Hello, everybody, and welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening for Mondays at the Mess Talk, St. Patrick's Athletic, the pride of Inchicore. Mondays at the Mess is a series of talks run by Richmond Barracks in Inchicore to celebrate the rich stories and experiences of the local community, past and present. Richmond Barracks is run by Dublin City Council Culture Company, which runs cultural initiatives and buildings across the city with and for the people of Dublin. My name is Fergus Whelan. In a few moments, I'm going to hand you over to tonight's speaker, Dermot Looney. But before we start, I want to let you know that there will be time at the end of this presentation for some questions. If you want to ask a question, kindly use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we possibly can. I'd like you to know that this is being recorded and it will be shared at a later date on our channels. If you want to be told when this is available and find out more about our projects and events, please sign up for our newsletter. We'll put a link for the newsletter into the chat box in the course of the presentation. Our speaker tonight is Dermot Looney. Dermot is researching the history of St. Patrick's Athletic for the A History St. Pat's project. You can find that on Twitter. A Pats fan from Greens Hill, he claims to have Inchicore roots. He's a primary teacher and a former county councillor and mayor of Sound County, Dublin. So without any further ado, let me hand you over to Dermot.
Thanks, Fergus. Thanks for that lovely introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. Just before I start off, as well as thanking Fergus, I want to thank Zoe, who's helped set up the call, and Kate from the Dublin City Council Culture Company for organising this, for hosting this, for getting in touch. Look, thanks to everybody for joining. It's a lovely evening out there. I know the football fans amongst you are probably sandwiching this in between the Euros games or maybe watching it back. But I do want to thank people for taking time to look in, and we've a good number of people in. And just, as Fergus was saying, there is a question and answer set up for the people who are joining us live. It would be great to get some questions and then some comments and some corrections and all of those things that we can take at the end. I know we're not going to spend too long on the call this evening. We've certainly done before 8 o'clock. So I'm going to go through things fairly quickly. I do have a presentation to give. But just to begin by saying, as Fergus says, I'm not from Inchicore. My dad is, so I think that qualifies as having Inchicore roots. And I am a Pats fan pretty much all my life, certainly since I was a teenager. I'm an amateur historian, and the emphasis is very much an amateur for me. And Fergus is a fantastic historian and great tour guide. I did a great tour with him of Inchicore. So, I'm very much from the amateur school of things, and I really appreciate when people contact me and kind of correct or give me other information that I wasn't aware of. This is a learning process for me, looking at the history and the story of St. Patrick's Athletic. I began this back in 2018 when I realised, there's no book written about St. Pat's. There is about most of the other big League of Ireland clubs. Certainly our three rivals in Dublin, Shamrock Rovers, Bohemians and Shelbourne all have books about them and stories about them. So I'm working on that. But I've also given several of these talks, podcast interviews, and run a Twitter account called History St. Pat's. So if you're interested in finding out a little bit more, we put some things up there. I also contribute to the St. Pat's programme, and every week in that, or every edition of it, I put a kind of season by season review of the history of the club, starting all the way back with the formation. So yeah, I'm delighted to be able to learn from people like the people on this call. Many of you are football fans, but some of you aren't, and I'm trying to theme this call and this chat more around the social and community history of the football club rather than league wins and so on. And so yeah, just to begin, I suppose, by talking about the pride of Inchicore. So that title, the pride of Inchicore, which I've given to this talk. So I was with Fergus on a walking tour around Inchicore and learned so much about, people, for example, who fought in the Spanish Civil War, who came from the area. There's so much about Inchicore of which we should all be proud. And so that name, that title, is a name that Pats sometimes give to themselves, but it obviously applies to many other things. The Pats nicknames are interesting in and of themselves. Like we call ourselves St. Pats, or the Saints. It used to be the Super Saints when I was following Pats in the 90s. The older nickname for St. Pat's is actually the Athletic, or Athletic on its own. So maybe we'll get that one brought back. But in terms of the pride of Inchicore, it's been used for trains quite a lot. So the history of Inchicore and the railway works. There was a engine 402 in the 1930s was called the Pride of Inchicore. There was another one built in 1880 called that. And there was a third one called Maeve. That was the name of the engine, which was also nicknamed the Pride of Inchicore. There's some kind of funnier uses of the name. Jimmy O'Dea, the great actor, had a character of that name in the Gaiety Theatre pantomime in the 1940s. Gay Mitchell, who some of you may know, when he ran for President of Ireland, was referred to it, I think, somewhat sardonically in the media as the Pride of Inchicore. There's a ballad on YouTube, which I found, about a girl from Inchicore called the Pride of Inchicore. But in terms of St. Patrick's Athletic, that the first archive I've found of it is in the 80s, where they were referring to Pats as this, the Pride of Inchicore. In fairness, the 80s, it seems very recently, but it is, a third of a century ago, back to 1988, when that reference was made. I think one of the early adopters of it is Con Houlihan, the great writer who I'm going to refer to a little bit this evening. So he, in 1989, wrote, that was a season where Pats went on to win the league, ending a famine of 34 years without a league title. And he said that younger fans were expectant given recent good form, but their elders among the St. Pat's fans know better. The pride of Inchicore are not always its joy. And beautiful writing from Con Houlihan, who knew all about the story of St. Patrick's Athletic. Con actually also used the phrase the pride of Inchicore to describe the one and only Paul McGrath. I think we're more than happy to share that. So talking of sharing, I'm going to share my screen now. I do have a presentation for you. This will just give us a few jumping off points, I suppose, to talk about St. Patrick's Athletic. You'll see there lots of the different crests that have been used over the year by the club. And the picture there is actually beside the dressing rooms in Richmond Park now, put up this year with the motto, the pride of Inchicore, above the crest of the club. That's the first time I've ever seen it written down outside of a programme or a newspaper. So Pat certainly used it. And of course, the club motto, which is Níart go Cúr le Chéile. I asked on Twitter a couple of weeks ago to Inchicorians and those who have lived in or love Inchicore, other than St. Pat's, what in your opinion is the pride of Inchicore? Now there's a whole lot of answers, and you'll be able to see the screen there in terms of some of the answers that people gave on Twitter, and thanks to everybody who answered in. So there are buildings, there are organisations, there's the Oblats Church and the grounds to the back of it, the barracks itself, the Works Estate, Golden Bridge Walk, all sorts of clubs, local businesses. Lots of people mentioned pubs. I won't put all their names up here. One other answer that came in was the people of Inchicore are its pride, which of course is number one, the number one truth. But I think the most interesting one, and it's an interesting starting point for talking about a football club, is the railway works. And I think it was Paul McGuire is on the call. Paul is a St. Pat's fan and also interested in the railway works. He said that the work shaped the whole area, maintained the fleet of locomotives and rolling stock that enabled the first mass movement of people and goods on this island, and was a centre of excellence and innovation. That's very true indeed. So the pride of Inchicore in many ways is originally GSWR works, then the GSR and CIE works, where the trains were built. But the story of St. Patrick's Athletic is very much also the story of that works. Just before I really get into it, to this, the tie-in of St. Pat's and Inchicore, there was a gentleman called Jerry McCord who sadly passed away last year. And Jerry played for St. Pat's for a time in the 1950s. He grew up in Inchicore and in the 1940s was a supporter as a kid who used to climb under corrugated fences to get in to watch matches when Pats were in the Leinster Senior League. He wrote a beautiful piece, which I've shared several times in articles and online. And he said three things to me are synonymous: the Camac, St. Patrick's Athletic and Inchicore. All three have played and continue to play a very significant part of my life. They cannot be separated. That's not the truth for everybody. There are plenty of people in Inchicore who aren't football fans or don't have a particular attachment to St. Pat's. But there are certainly thousands who over the past 90 odd years have had a huge attachment connection to the football club. Another older fan said to me that to me, Inchicore is Pat's and Pat's are Inchicore. And again, for many people, that is true. The tie-in of both the football club and what it means to the community. Con Houlihan, who I spoke of earlier, the famous sports writer, who's of course from Kerry, but became an adopted Pats fan, wrote that the very heart of Inchicore is a rectangle of ground off Emmett Road on its western side. This is Richmond Park, the home of St. Patrick's Athletic Football Club. I think if you look up St. Pat's on Google or Wikipedia, you get a good, if not always accurate, overview of the football club. So it says we were founded in 1929, which is correct. We moved to Richmond Park in 1930. That's not correct. That's one of the Wikipedia errors. That actually happened in 1939. It says we were the champions of Ireland 8 times. And for those Pats fans amongst you, that will rankle with us because we think it's 9. That's a longer story than we have time for today. And the chat we're having today, as I've said, it's not really a story of league wins and players, but of course they're a part of it. It's a social history, it's a community history. It's the history of a club which, in and of itself, is a living and thriving community, but which has also been at the heart of the Inchicore community and that of the wider area, Ballyfermot, Drimna, all the way to Clondalkin and further afield, for nearly 100 years. So just to show this slide now, again, as I've said, our Pats itself is a community and has a history of itself as a community of people, players, officials, volunteers and fans. Started off as a very tiny football club, primarily just the players, 1 or 2 people who helped run the team, and at times has been a massive football club with, 22,000 people attending a league game back in the 50s, going to Europe and playing in front of huge crowds, representing Ireland in European competitions and so on. So that is a history of the St. Patrick's athletic community, but also St. Pat's has its place in the history and community of Inchicore, and not just Inchicore, but South and West Dublin. So those other communities I've spoken about. So, when Pats were formed, Drimna is kind of being built at that stage, Crumlin, as major suburbs. Later on comes Ballyfermot, which is so important in the history of the area, and Pats are so important in the history of Ballyfermot, which is a great soccer community. And then later on again, and towards modern times, you have a lot of the people from the Inchicore area moving further south and further west to the likes of Clondalkin, where there's a huge St. Pat's base, and nowadays even into Kildare. So there's a huge history of St. Patrick's Athletic in a community sense there. We often talk about St. Pat's being a family club, and that's sometimes used as a bit of a cliche or almost even to knock us, but it is so accurate for St. Pat's, possibly even more so than it might be for other football clubs. So you see at Pat's games, when we go back, some of us are very lucky to be going back this Friday for the Sligo match, a small number, but in normal times you see very often 3 generations of the same family attending games, and that's not all that common in football in Ireland. So it's support that's being passed from generation to generation, and the amount of people who contact me doing the history work on the club and say that their grandfather played for the club, or their great grandfather or uncle, or their mother used to sew the badges onto the gear and so on. So there's this great family tradition, and there are some families like the Cummins family most famously who have huge numbers of people involved with the club in various different capacities over the years. I think it's important to recognise St. Pat's, and this may not be the fashion at the moment, but I think it's important to recognise this as a working class club. So a club founded by workers from the CIE Works, a club very much supported and kept alive by ordinary people who are not well off, particularly the people of Inchicore, over 90 years. It's so important in the history of association football in the island to recognise that soccer has been the sport of the urban working class, and St. Pat's very much fit into that. Now, of course, we've supporters, no doubt, of all different classes, but at its base, St. Pat's comes from the tradition of ordinary working people. Pats have also been a hugely successful football club, and sometimes when we're not playing too well, we can all forget about this, but very few clubs founded in 1929 still exist, and even fewer have gone on to major success on a national scale. So St. Pat's were formed and started at the very bottom of football, a thing called the Intermediate League, playing in the 15 acres in the Phoenix Park, and have gone on to become champions of Ireland on 9 or 8 separate occasions, if you want to say that. And they're the only, for example, they've played in the League of Ireland for 70 years. They've never been relegated. They're the only club never to have finished bottom. They just have there's an astonishing amount of success, not just in terms of winning trophies, winning leagues and cups, but also of sustaining and keeping that football club going. And there is a bit of a Pat's way from a football point of view of playing decent, good football, and that's certainly been the case in recent years, even though we may not have been very successful most recently. And finally, from a historical point of view, Pats are a railway club. And people forget this, and when I started following Pats, I didn't know this, that St. Patrick's Athletic were built and supported by the workers of the GSR and later on the CIE Works. I'll just talk a little bit about that as we go on. very briefly, and I'm not going to talk at length on this at all, Pats are founded in the context of Inchicore history and also footballing history. And many of you on the call will know, and certainly Fergus and people involved with the Barracks know so much about, and it's really worth checking out the Barracks website and going on tours and so on, about the Kilmainham Inchicore History Society, Heritage Society, the history of the Grand Canal, which is so important in Inchicore, of the Barracks itself, and of the works. And the work starts, during famine times, 1846. The works begins in Inchicore, but the community that comes around it, it's a really good housing development in the works estate, and later on in the ranch. And those two estates are hugely important in the football, in the sense of our football club, St. Pat's, and in soccer history too. And there's a really strong community infrastructure in Inchicore right from its development from that kind of time on, from the 1840s and 50s on. It's a skilled working class of people. There's a lot of people who've come from England and Scotland with their skills to build trains, to drive trains, and so on. And that has an influence on our football club. And then, of course, look, we can't ever forget the importance of Inchicore in the lockout, in the Rising, in the revolutionary period in Irish history. And that has so much tumult and changes so much of what happens in people's outlook and lives. It also delays, sport. Sport, it gets changed around the wars, for example. Just in terms of football, and Pats being formed in 1929, football has been played in Inchicore, and association football, by that I mean, since probably the 1880s and certainly the 1890s. So a very, very lengthy history. Football started on this island in Belfast mainly, and came to Dublin afterwards. And then the Leinster FA was formed in, I think it was 1892. And never had the greatest reputation among the true Gaels of Ireland, and particularly as we fought for independence. People like to run down our sport of association football. So when they were building the pitches in the Phoenix Park, which St. Pat's ended up playing their first games on, the Gaelic Athletic Association wrote, I think it was to the corporation, or wrote to somebody, and talked about Orange Catholics and West Britons playing soccer. I'm glad those days are long over, and we've had, there's been great connections between Pats and GAA players and clubs over the years, but it didn't start all that well. Football is also called in Ireland the garrison game. I think that's a little bit unfair. Certainly soldiers did play it, and they played it in Inchicore. But football historians tend to talk about things like industrialisation, urbanisation, and better transport being crucial to the rollout of football in every country. And if you think about Inchicore, those three things really sum up Inchicore. So you had industrialisation, not only with the coming of the works, but also lots of other industries in the area. You have urbanisation, so you have people, living in tight spaces, and major developments of housing, and you have transport. And Inchicore is such a transport hub, not just for trains, but later on for trams and for buses too. So I think they're probably more important in the history of football in Inchicore than the garrison game being played. Really quickly, where does St. Pat's come from? Partly from Gaelic games almost. So the first St. Patrick's football team in Inchicore is a Gaelic football team. Starts around 1886, plays some of its matches at a place called either St. Patrick's Field or Spendlove's Field, basically very close to where the Obelisk Church is now. And they moved for a brief time and played in Richmond Park. So the first St. Patrick's to play in Richmond Park were actually a Gaelic football team. There was also a St. Patrick's Association football team, so soccer team. And these have great parallels to our club, even though they're formed in 1898, so 30 years before, basically. So Dick Neville is one of the founder members of it. They're an under-19 kind of apprentices team, lads who work in the CI, or the GSWR works as it was then. And they also seem to have played Gaelic first, and then they went on to play soccer. And they were called St. Patrick's, and that's probably where our name ultimately comes from, because their captain, Jack Mangan, lived on St. Patrick's Terrace in that estate, and they won a minor cup. So they were the initial St. Patrick's team of Inchicore. Now, where does our team come? Well, it comes a bit further down the line, but the railway is very important to that. We have that St. Patrick's FC lasting until about 1903. I'm going to skip fairly quickly through this, and then you have another team specifically out of the work, so GSWR Football Club. And it's basically St. Patrick's merging, because St. Patrick's, the original team, are all railway workers. So they merge and they seem to form GSWR Football Club. They play for about 16 years. They've lots of trouble during the war. Their pitch in the pond field gets taken for use for farming and so on during the war. The pond field, people will know, is in the Works estate in Inchicore. They basically went out of football for a few years, but then later on, a GSR Football Club is formed again out of the Works. And they play, these were teams playing at fairly high levels, particularly GSWR played in the Leinster League Division 1, which in those days for Dublin clubs was pretty much as high as you could get. There were only two maybe Dublin teams in the Irish League before the split in Irish football. GSR Football Club are also playing Leinster League football, so a fairly high standard of amateur football. They had an interesting decision in the year 1929, possibly 1930, but I think it's 1929, as to whether or not they would take on another youth team, and that's where our St. Patrick's Athletic story comes from. And just before I moved to that, there was loads of football going on in Inchicore. In fact, there was even League of Ireland football going on in Inchicore. There's a team called Olympia, who were originally from the Coombe, who played in where the just beside the canal. And there was Brideville, who played in Richmond Park. They were from the Liberties, but they played League of Ireland football in Richmond Park in the 1920s. Inchicore United, who were a big Leinster Senior League club, played in Richmond Park too. So football is this great tradition in Inchicore. And in that cauldron of a tradition, this football club of ours, St. Patrick's Athletic, formed in 1929. So there are lots of stories about how St. Pat's were formed. I've read loads of them, and some of them are very conflicting. Stories about where it happened, when it happened, and how they got their name. I think there are mysteries to be solved, but we've managed over the last couple of years to solve some of them. One of the big problems is 1929. It's literally on the St. Pat's crest, and we trace our history back to 1929. There's a slight problem with that, and that's that St. Pat's did not compete in any competitive football in 1929 to 1930, certainly not under the name St. Patrick's Athletic. The first appearance of Pat's in competitive football is in the following season, 1930 to 31. I think really what happened is they formed and they played kind of informal games around the CIE work. So we have a picture of them. This is the famous picture, which was the title of this talk. And that was supposedly taken in June 1929 in the pond field in Inchicore, the GSR work. So they don't seem to have played competitively for the first year, and the second year they did. So Pat Dunphy, who was a founder member of the club, he was interviewed in 1989. We have a tape cassette of that. And he just spoke about how the club was formed. So he was a young lad, 16 or so, working in the GSR works. Himself and his teenage friends tried to get a football team going, and they asked the GSR to take on a second or even a third team, a youth team as such. And they were basically told no. So they met, as all good St. Patrick's Athletic meetings happen. It happened in McDowell's pub. And they decided to form their own club. They just said they would call it St. Patrick's, probably because of that tradition of clubs called St. Patrick's in Inchicore. And this seems to have been, certainly they had this crunch meeting anyway around August, September 1930. They gathered up £1 guinea, which is £1 and a shilling, and they decided to enter the intermediate league of the AOL, who were still involved in running football under the Leinster Football Association. Now, they were just going to call the team St. Patrick's, but that was really confusing. There were too many teams of that name already. So they decided to throw on Athletic. There had been previously a club called that, who played in Inchicore, but this is our club, formed in 1929, and Pat Dunphy tells that story. So here's the first team, again, talking about this picture. The picture here is from June 1929. But the first team who are listed here is actually the team who played in 1930, but almost all of these names are in it. So we know it's the same group of people. But you can look at the picture and you can see they're kids, right? They're young lads. And yet what I find really remarkable about this first team who played and about this picture is the footballing success of many of these young men. So if you look in the front row, for example, on the left, the guy kind of kneeling down is Des Dempsey. Des Dempsey was an absolute stalwart of St. Patrick's Athletic on and off the pitch. He ended up playing League of Ireland football. He played for Bray Unknowns. He was going to go to Shamrock Rovers at one stage. So he had a great football career at St. Pat's, where he won many, many trophies, but onto the League of Ireland as well. He was also secretary, in essence, of St. Patrick's Athletic, and many of our, from a historical point of view, it's brilliant that he wrote in beautiful handwriting all the minute books from throughout the 1930s. To the right of the football is Matty Gagan lying down. Now, Matty Gagan, again, a kid playing on that first team from the ranch in Inchicore, went on not only to play for Pats for a few years, but to play League of Ireland football and Irish League football. So he played for the great Belfast Celtic, played for Shamrock Rovers, played for St James's Gate, but also played for Ireland. And in those days, there were very few international games. There were lots of problems with Ireland and the North and so on. He played in 2 international games and, in fact, scored for Ireland in the Free State era. So remarkable. There's another player in that team, if we can see him there, yes, Tom Smith, who also played League of Ireland football. It is remarkable to think these guys went on and had extraordinary footballing lives, forming as they were just a kids team, an under-18s team, as they in essence were in the Inchicore works. Another player there is Jim Cummins, and the Cummins family, as I've already mentioned, are so important in the history of St. Pat's. This is the original Jim Cummins. His cousin, Jimmy Timber Cummins, becomes a Pats legend much later on. But his brother, Bart Cummins, was a club official all the way through, I think almost to the 1990s, certainly to the 80s. So the Cummins family have a huge tradition with St. Patrick's Athletics. So when we talk about the pride of Inchicore, we have families like the Cummins family, other names there. I see lots of McGibneys have been involved in St. Pat's over the years. And that's a great GSR Works family who have sustained and kept the club going for a long, long time. This was a very successful football club right from the start. So they entered the Intermediate League. They played in the Phoenix Park. They won it on their first attempt. They then went up and they just kept climbing league after league on and on. So they won the AUL divisions 3, 2 and 1, and they entered the Leinster Senior League, which is still going. It's a very high level of amateur football. And they won the second division of the Leinster Senior League, but they weren't promoted. They had to stay in that throughout the war years. But after World War II, St. Pat's got promoted to the Leinster Senior League Division 1, which they won 4 times in a row. They were knocking on the door of the League of Ireland. Now, in those days, the Leinster Senior League Division 1 was the second tier of football in Ireland. There were 10 teams usually in the League of Ireland, and Pats were, at the level below that. And they frightened the Jesus out of the League of Ireland clubs on many occasions, knocking the likes of Shamrock Rovers out of the FAI Cup, beating Bohemians in Shelbourne, on the way to a Leinster Senior Cup win, and so on. So Pats, by the late 1940s, were really a dominant force in non-league football and knocking on the door of the League of Ireland. They won the FAI Junior Cup, that's the picture in the top left there. In the early 1940s, they won the FAI Minor Cup, which is still around, it's now called the Youth Cup. They won the FAI Intermediate Cup. So they were this really successful team, attracting thousands of people to games, and really, as I said, knocking on the door of the League of Ireland by the 1950s. Pats have always been of Inchicore, but they haven't always played in Inchicore, if you get my meaning. So, as I said, Pats started out playing in the Phoenix Park in the 15 acres, which is still the home of junior football in Dublin to some extent. Because that was, where you started when you played at a low level. You didn't have to rent a ground. You could just, maybe pay a fee for a year. The following year, they moved grounds, but they didn't move, as Wikipedia tells you, to Richmond Park. They moved to Bluebell, and there was a pitch there in Bluebell Lane. So those who know the area now, around where that Mr. Price is now off Kylmore Road, there was a pitch there near the factory that was there, and Pats played there for a couple of years. I think it was owned by the Flood sisters who lived up in Port Leicester House. For a couple of years, Pats then played in Chapel Izard. Now, still we're talking about the 30s here, and Pats played not in the later stadium of Chapel Izard, but a little bit down the road from that. They moved back to Bluebell in the late 30s before settling in Richmond Park in 1939. So they had been trying to get into Richmond Park for a couple of years, but eventually Mr. McDowell, who became club president and very associated with the club, gave them a long-term lease on Richmond Park. Now, that's not the end of the story, because when Pats entered the League of Ireland in 1951, they had to move out of Inchicore. Their base was still Richmond Park. Their base was still 125 Emmett Road, which is the club offices even still, but they had to play most of their games away from Richmond Park. Now, this, as you might know, was a hugely successful time, not just for Pats, but for the thousands of Inchicore people and people from other neighbourhoods nearby who followed the club, but they had to go elsewhere in Dublin to do it. The reason why is Richmond Park wasn't up to standard. Now, the people of Inchicore came together, they fundraised, and they literally built and dug out and made foundations and so on, around Richmond Park and were able to get the club to move back. They were very ambitious in some of their plans, many of which were never realised, but they had to travel throughout the 50s to Milltown, Glenmalure Park, to Chapel Izard Stadium, which is pictured down there. It was a Greyhound and Speedway Stadium. It's probably the closest to a home ground they had until they got back to Richmond Park. They also, Pats, had to play in Dalymount Park in Phibsborough. So even though the 50s were a hugely successful time for Pats, they had to do it away from Inchicore. As people will know, when Pats came back to Richmond Park, very little was done with the ground until the 1980s, by which time they had to move out to redevelop it. Pats nearly never came back. They spent 4 years in Harold's Cross, in the Greyhound Stadium there. There were all sorts of financial troubles, and Richmond Park at one stage had sheep grazing on it and was nearly lost. And only for the intervention of some fans, and famously Brian Kerr, the manager at the time, Pats were able to return to a redeveloped Richmond Park. Obviously, Pats have played European games away, but Richmond Park has been our home ground, I suppose, since 1939, but with a couple of changes. Certainly, we've been ever present there since 1993. Who's to say what the future has for us? Just on that last slide before I move off it, Con Houlihan also wrote that this club has a remarkable history. For a long time, its members and its followers were like one of the lost tribes of Israel. Just to note, Pats were champions of Ireland in the 1950s, as we know. Some of the team and the medals there, the great golden era of the 50s onto the 60s, where they played in these different grounds. And they had, 3 league wins. They won 2 FAI Cups, lots of smaller cups. Even the reserves were getting in on the act. Pats were, to me, the team, or certainly one of the teams of the 1950s. What an extraordinary achievement it was, having only been founded in 1929, to get to that stage. But it only happened because of the input of the people of Inchicore to it. So I'm coming towards the end now, but I do want to speak about, why are St. Pat's the pride of Inchicore? What's the real connection here with the people of Inchicore? Well, in truth, Pats couldn't exist without the financial, footballing, and infrastructural support of the people of Inchicore. So right from the early days, from the 1930s, Pats were running things called football doubles. They were basically like pools, and that was a way of sustaining the club. So they went around local pubs, they went around the CIE works, particularly selling these, raffle tickets and pool tickets and so on. So the club got great local support in terms of funding the football club. It's quite expensive to run, and in terms of people attending games. There were annual dances. You can see in some of the images I have there. The dances often took place in Ariswira. There were things like bands and jitterbug dancing. And there were, special deals for ladies and all this kind of stuff. So very funny to us looking back at it now, but really important events. There were also lots of outings. So, for example, as early as the 1930s, all the Pats players, officials, but also fans, and this is a junior club, a small junior club, went down to Mullingar for a day out. They played a match against the local club, and then they all went to the Fairview Hotel, and they had dinner and dancing there together. So outings for the football club are really important, and they would have brought down so many of their supporters at that stage, even in those early days. Sweepstakes were also really important to fundraising for the club, so they organised this huge sweepstake on something called the Phoenix Plate, which was a horse race in the Phoenix Park, and there was huge money raised for that, and that was for the Richmond Park Redevelopment Fund as they were looking to enter the League of Ireland. And then just sponsorship, and I'm going to talk to you very quickly about sponsorship. And this here is the earliest, I don't know if you can see it there on the screen, it's the earliest programme I have for St. Patrick's Athletic. It's not mine, I was given a lend of it, and it's from 1950, and it's from a match that St. Pat's played against Shelbourne. Now, why am I talking about this in terms of financing and fundraising? Well, if you look at all of the people and companies taking out ads in it, you have the Cummins Brothers of Inchicore, you have O'Sullivan and Sons shoe specialists out in Thomas Street, you have Patrick Marr, bookmaker in Inchicore, you have the Mullingar House in Chapel Izard, MacDowell's famously, the pub in Emmett Road, you have O'Reilly's newsagents, tobacconists and confectioner on Emmett Road, Pierce Redmond's grocer and provision merchant on Emmett Road, the high-class shoe repairs of Quinn's on Emmett Road in Inchicore, and also O'Hanlon Limited Automobile Engineers of Inchicore, and O'Brien's high-class victuallers and contractors on Grattan Crescent, Inchicore. It is the local businesses that kept St. Pat's going by funding things like programs that enable them to pay players and that enable them to fund, transport to away games, ground developments, and so on. And that continues right through to the present day. So Pats and Inchicore tied up so much. Just briefly, Pats are, I keep saying, a railway club. So, Pats fans, not too much nowadays, although there are occasional still trains to matches and so on. But they travelled, particularly in the late 40s and then in the 50s as a League of Ireland team, all the way through the 60s and so on, to away games. Hundreds and sometimes thousands of fans getting on trains at Houston or Kingsbridge Station, as it was known before 1966, and going to away games in the likes of Waterford and Dundalk and Limerick and Sligo and Cork. And Con Houlihan writes here about first encountering Pats fans when Pats played Evergreen United in the FAI Cup down in Cork. And the Inchicore is a railway village. The faithful travel down to Cork on a special train. The nucleus of the following was family groups, some represented by 3 generations. They seemed to fear that Cork was experiencing a food shortage. They came well supplied. They took out their flasks and their sandwiches and picnicked on the green grass during the interval. I liked it, and I liked their sporting attitude to the game. Pats lost with honour. It was all very civilised. And even in 1948, I have a clipping there from a paper which also spoke about Pats as a railway works team. So fans going to game on train, enjoying those away trips. And then just finally, Richmond Park has been this important community hub to Inchicore, being used for fundraising, being used for rock festivals, being used recently as a food bank and in essence a type of a community centre, but of course mainly football. So what is the future? Just a couple of questions to leave you all with. What does St. Pat's give Inchicore? What does Inchicore give St. Pat's? And can we transform almost a century of community tradition into something relevant to the Inchicore of the decades to come? So I'm going to pass back to you now, Fergus, and thanks everybody for bearing with me and for listening. I might have ended a little bit early, which is, probably doesn't happen because I tend to go on a little bit. So maybe while I'm waiting for Fergus to come on, I can see there are a couple of comments coming in, but you can put your questions into the chat there. I do have another quote, which is a great quote from 1937 I was going to read out, which was from the chairman of the club. He said, "The season had been successful as it showed the loyalty of the players and supporters in standing by the club, even though we had no hope of winning anything." So I think that says a lot about Pats fans and about Inchicore as the years have gone on.
There are no questions as of yet. Oh, here we go. Was there a link between Bulfin Rovers and St. Pat's? Margaret Nolan wants to know.
So there are loads and loads of clubs. Bulfin United is the one that's probably most famous. It was a youth club. It was basically a nursery club, not just for Pats, but it was kind of along the lines of like Home Farm, Stella Maris, those kind of big junior or underage clubs in Inchicore. Bulfin Rovers is just not one that I've come across. But again, I'm learning all the time. So maybe I'm not sure what era Bulfin Rovers played in themselves. But there have been dozens of clubs. I mean, I was looking through, lists and lists of soccer clubs that played in Inchicore. And no doubt that was an important one for the time period it was there for. All sorts of sports have been popular in Inchicore. Boxing was hugely popular. Athletics hugely popular. Gaelic games hugely popular. But soccer has maintained that area for well over 100 years. And so there have been these great soccer clubs that have been so important for that era and fed on. Maybe they were renamed and so on. So not Bulfin Rovers, but certainly Bulfin United, or a club I'm very much aware of. They provided lots of important young players, including Irish internationals. I think George Cummins played. Certainly Joe Haverty played for Bulfin United, who went on to play for Arsenal and Ireland. Had a brief time at Pats as well.
Another question from Pat. What year did Mung Jerry play at Richer?
Yeah, so Mungo Jerry is people who people might know was a band. They sang In the Summertime as a big hit in 1970. And someone decided that it was going to be a great idea to have Ireland's first open-air rock festival. Of course, rock and roll in 1970 it was such a big year for 69. It just happened, right? The swinging 60s were over, and there's going to be great rock festivals in Ireland. They were just a bit early doing this, and there were some great festivals in the 70s, but in 1970, there hadn't really been one yet. So Mungo Jerry were playing, and a little-known local band by the name of Thin Lizzy were also on the lineup for that gig in Richmond Park. I think it was September the 4th, 1970. But what happened was there was a bit of a scare in the media. The guards weren't happy this was going ahead, even though it had permission. There were some scares around drugs, which, of course, in that time period, people were terrified that people might be off their heads on drugs and what damage it might cause and so on. So these scare tactics meant that the expected crowd of several thousands were not going to come. So it was a bit of a damn squib. There were reviews of it in the papers and magazines at the time that said it was a bit of a disaster, even though they brought floodlights in. So I think it's the first time there were floodlights in Richmond Park. They didn't come into the football ground until the 1990s. But, Phil Lynott and Mungo Jerry and the rest didn't seem to have a great time in front of a couple of hundred in a damp, wet Richmond Park in September 1970.
Well, the questions and reactions are flowing in here now, Dermot. So can you see them there yourself? What's the link between transport and the railway works?
Well, great question. So I'd assume it's Transport Football Club, who are a great League of Ireland and Leinster Senior League club. And I'm lucky. Most of these I don't know the answers to, but I do know this one because I just found it out quite recently. So Transport were basically, when CIE was formed just after the war, Transport were a football club formed, but they had originally come from, I think it was Midland Athletic, Tramway United. So they were tram companies. So GSR were the train side of CIE, but Transport Football Club had actually come from the tram side of CIE. And Transport themselves weren't based in Dublin, they were based in Bray, and they played in the Carlisle grounds, which is now home of Bray Wanderers. But they were a major club in the 40s in the Leinster Senior League and had great ding-dong rivalries with Pats. They were admitted to the League of Ireland before Pats were, and Pats weren't too happy about this. But unfortunately, by the end of the 50s, Transport weren't much of a force anymore, dropped out, but still play at an amateur level.
A Bowls fan wants to know, when did St. Pat's turn professional?
So it's hard to tell because I reckon, as often happens, and the football people here will notice that sometimes players get money on the side and it's not too well publicised. So it's very likely that Pats had some people who were getting paid for them, even in the Leinster Senior League era, given the crowds are massive. And this is something we can't take now. We're all watching the Euros at the moment on screens, but of course, before television, people went to matches. It was a great form of entertainment. I was reading about Pat's FAI Junior Cup 5th round game, a kind of a nothing game, out in the middle of nowhere in Lucan, which in those days was real countryside, against Spa Rovers. There were something like 3,000 people at the match. So even for those kind of games, there were Leinster Senior League games and so on, there were big crowds. So there would have been a few quid knocking around the club. So there were certainly paying players in the Leinster Senior League era to some extent. And Pats have flirted with full-time professionalism. They're currently a full-time professional team, at times part-time, at times full-time, or at times some people would have been full-time pros. One interesting story, Fergus, I will tell you about it though, is in one of Pat's cup runs, I think it's 1954, the players weren't getting paid for playing in the matches, but what happened was the club went down to the bookies and put, I think it was £100 on the team to win the FAI Cup that year. If they had won it, I think the odds were 20 or 30 to 1. Every player would have been able to buy a house. So the players were going to get the winnings of this. Unfortunately, they were beaten in the final. So it
they would probably be put in jail for that now. Any idea about future stadium plans in terms of, is it going to be redeveloped? Is there any chance that Pats will move out of there?
Well, there was a plan, just people be aware of, to move very, very close to Richmond Barracks. I'm not sure what the status is of that plan. I think what we want as St. Pat's fans is for Pats to remain in Inchicore. I was involved in 2007, 2006 or so in a group called Pats for Richmond. There was a big fear that we were going to be forced to move to Tallaght Stadium against our wishes. We were successful in that campaign, and Gareth Keller, who is the owner of the club now, bought the club and ensured that we would stay in Inchicore. So long may that last. Richmond Park is certainly in need of some TLC and some redevelopment. It would be fabulous to redevelop that, but certainly we want to stay in Inchicore.
Okay, gentlemen, I think you've given us a very comprehensive talk. Thanks you very much indeed, and for answering all those questions so competently. And I'd like to thank all of you people who have tuned in here tonight, and hope to see you at events in the future. We as well as these Tea Time Talks, we run other types of things. We run the Tea Time Talks series, as well as the Monday at the Mess Talks, we run Tea Time Talks that celebrate the stories of the 300 years of the history of 14 Henrietta Street. We run culture clubs, a series of hosted talks and tours that introduce and encourage people to connect with cultural spaces in the city. And we also run the National Neighbourhoods, a year-round programme that creates ways for people to see and make culture in their place with the people they know. All of these things you can find on our website. We've posted the link in the chat shop. Thanks again, Dermot, and we'll see you on again sometime in the future. Bye now.
Thanks, Fergus.